El Clasico, the biggest football match on earth, has been for a long time now. Even if La Liga is at its worst, even if the galactic players of old are absent, even if the managers prowling the touchline are inadequate, the dancing of Blanco and Blaugrana never fails to capture the imagination. Real Madrid versus Barcelona, as a football match, had its bright spots from time to time, either side of the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. Much like any football match featuring two teams from two colossal cities. As the dictatorship of General Franco took its stranglehold on the country, the Clasico was most notable for the differing politics of the two clubs, and by association, two cities, than anything on the pitch. The Catalan versus the Castilian. It is the work of one man and the most important transfer in the history of the sport that the rivalry ascended to the planes that it did. Alfredo di Stefano's transfer to Real Madrid changed not just Madrid, Barcelona and Spain, but the entirety of football from the second half of the 20th century onwards. This film hopes to explain why. Spanish football isn't special. This in the sense that they can thank the almighty deities from England for delivering football before, quite rightly, turning their backs on their couriers to form their own ideas about the sport. The quickest way to get to Spain from the British Isles in the late 19th century was a boat from the south coast of the UK to the northern tips of Spain or the Basque Country, and notably Bilbao. 12 hours with a good wind behind them, the English pitched up in Bilbao and Spain did not look back. The game spread from the Basque Country to Catalonia with a pit stop in Madrid in between. Three very different places with very different politics and viewpoints of the Spanish life. Athletic club Real Madrid and FC Barcelona were born and each borrowed a little bit of England along the way. Barcelona took their colours from an old English school where some of their very first players came from, even if the club now opts to believe that the Swiss businessman and founding president of the Blaugrana gifted them their famous colours. Madrid was a city who borrowed a footballing rulebook from Manchester, Real, a team whose all-white kit was lifted from the famous Corinthians team in London. Meanwhile, Athletic birthed La Furia, which needs no translation and effectively involves a physical, brutish style of play. Yet it was in none of these cities, future behemoths of the Spanish game, where the first football in Spain was kicked. No, it was actually first played in the little southwestern port city of Huelva, that sits equidistant between the Portuguese border and Seville. Recreativo would soon sprout up, as did Sevilla, Real Betis, Deportivo and Sporting Gijón, as well as the aforementioned eventual giants. The Spanish game was now locked in. 2,000 people attended the very first Clasico in the early 1900s after Barcelona advertised for players in classified adverts and Real Madrid was inaugurated with informal kickabouts. From humble beginnings, Spain just needed a springboard and the Antwerp Olympics in 1920 was that. A team dominated by players from the Basque region, 13 in total, Spain backdoored their way to a silver medal and captured the imagination of the public. Its two biggest stars are still immortalised to this day, a century on. Pichichi, the elder statesman of the squad, banged the goals in left, right and centre, and is today the namesake for the Golden Boot winner in Spain. Ricardo Zamora, alternatively, just 19 years of age at the Olympics, was the starting goalkeeper, and the Zamora Award is handed out for the country's best goalkeeper every season. The game turned professional. It overtook bullfighting as the nation's pastime, and after the Second World War, the unshackling from its English roots was complete with a transformative tour of the Argentine side San Lorenzo in 1946. The South Americans pitched up, devoured the Portuguese national team and thumped Spain 7-5 and 6-1 in consecutive matches, as well as teaching the club teams a lesson. Theirs was a pass and move brand of football, and Spain was gripped. The country benefited from no true dominant force upon the inception of La Liga in 1929. In the 24 years until Alfredo di Stefano's grand entrance into Spanish football, the league championships were almost evenly distributed, an open book. Barcelona led the way with 6 titles, the influential Athletic Club just behind them on 5, Atletico Madrid on 4, with Valencia and Real Madrid claiming 3 and 2 titles respectively, and the local rivals Sevilla and Betis sharing 2. Meanwhile, Barcelona trumped Real 11 Copa titles to 9, whilst Athletic were far and away the dominant force in the competition that started all the way back in the early 1900s and had won it 17 times. The one time that the eventually named Clasico teams met in the Copa final was 1936, when Madrid won out 2-1 in a tight contest. The club game was shaped by, or scarred by, depending on your political leaning, by the Franco dictatorship that lasted until 1975. Atletico Madrid, taken under the literal wing of the Air Force and rebranded Atletico Aviación, won the first 2 titles after the Spanish Civil War. The Olympic hero Ricardo Zamora, who managed Atletico to those successes, was subsequently sacked after the accusation that he wasn't as sympathetic to the Franco cause as first believed. Meanwhile, Barcelona was a revolutionary place, in direct opposition to the dictatorship, as the Castilian Real Madrid was ultimately where Franco set up shop and birthed an endless stream of conspiracies. Barcelona fans would decry their handicapping in Spanish football as Real eloped to innumerable successes. The truth was that Franco, like many politicians attempting to hitch their wagon to a sports team, followed the success. Previously a fan of the great Athletic Club de Bilbao because he believed they represented the blood and thunder he wished to see in Spain, it also helped that they were successful. Ultimately, he went where the wind blew, and that was to Real Madrid as soon as they began to win. Before the Civil War, Barcelona had 1 league championship to their name, and in the period between 1940 and Di Stefano, they were the most successful Spanish team. That ascension to success in no way down to a transformative experience with the newfound dictatorship, but mere coincidence. In a world before the European Cup, it could be easily argued that Barcelona were in fact the best team in the world. They'd won the Copa Latina, a small competition that also featured the champions of France, Italy and Portugal. It was known as the season of the 5 cups in Barcelona, which also included the modern-day Spanish double of Liga and Copa. Barcelona's superiority was encapsulated not on the pitch, however, but off it, as they were easily able to sway Laszlo Kubala from Real Madrid to Barcelona by merely being interested in signing him. The Hungarian often underrated in comparison to his compatriots because he wasn't part of the magical Magyars in the 1950s, and he made Barcelona even better. If there was a threat of a team dominating La Liga, it was from Catalonia, not Madrid. They'd won the double twice in a row. So we go back to politicians hitching wagons to something successful. The one thing stopping Franco from becoming a Barcelona figurehead was the simple fact that they were politically diametrically opposed to one another. FC Barcelona of the Catalan capital and its supporters were seen as separatists, and the bitterness of what would become known as the Clasico reared its ugly head on June the 13th, 1943. It was the semi-final second leg of what was renamed in Franco's honour La Copa del Generalissimo. Reigning champions Barcelona took a 3-0 first leg lead into the Castilian Madrid and were frozen to an 11-1 defeat thanks to a torrent of physical and verbal abuse from the stands. It was a match that cast Barcelona as Franco's victims and Real Madrid as Franco's team. Yet that season Real had come close to relegation, finishing a distant 10th place in La Liga. Real Madrid wasn't Franco's team, at least not until one man tirelessly built the club literally from the ground up. Santiago Bernabeu held just about every job at the club before ascending to presidency. Notably a former player, he took on the role as club president in 1943 for what he envisioned to be for a year, but ended up to be for the remainder of his life. Bernabeu got the idea into his head that the club he called Little Madrid needed the monolithic structure of what would eventually become named in his honour. In the meantime, it would be known as Nuevo Estadio Chamartin, as it was built in 1947 on the old ground of the former stadium. From 22,000 to 100,000 fans for a club that averaged less than 20,000 supporters per season. The foundations laid, Bernabeu needed players for those foundations. Real Madrid hadn't finished in the top two for almost a decade. They'd not won the league for an unthinkable 20 years. Meanwhile, both Atletico Madrid and Barcelona had won the last 6 championships. Finally, Bernabeu identified the perfect player for his vision of Real Madrid. Alfredo di Stefano grew up in the barrios of Buenos Aires at a time where football was dominated by the River Plate nations of Argentina and Uruguay, both continentally and globally. The sudden importance of football to the region, as well as his grounding and development, made it almost inevitable that Di Stefano would become a footballer. And what a footballer he was. He soon became the centrepiece at River Plate, and he labelled himself delantero retrasado, which translates as a delayed centre-forward. But not just that, the man could do everything, from defence to midfield, a number 10 and a goalscorer. He was as if a classical libero from the future also had a finishing rating of 20 on Football Manager. Helenio Herrera noted that if Pelé was the lead violinist, then Alfredo Di Stefano was an entire orchestra. Bobby Charlton called him unplayable when his Manchester United side met and lost to Real Madrid in the semi-final of a European Cup. Outside of those testimonials, Di Stefano made his debut for River just after his 19th birthday, and via a loan at Huracan, the goals flowed for La Máquina. And they were only a machine thanks to players such as Di Stefano. 6,000 kilometres further north, a butterfly flapped its wings in Bogotá, and it triggered a hurricane of enormous proportions that would affect Argentina for years. Internal disputes between Di Mayor and the Colombian Football Federation and their split forced FIFA to suspend the league and the Colombian national team. Serendipitously, Argentina was suffering from a players' strike, and with FIFA's jurisdiction removed from Colombia, El Dorado football was born. Argentine players needed somewhere to play. Colombia was flush with money to pay new players, and the floodgates opened with the signing of Adolfo Pedernera from River Plate to Millonarios. The phrase "the signing paid for itself" is wildly misused in today's football, but Pedernera's wages were paid and then some, with the first bloated gate receipts that both he and Millonarios benefited from. This triggered a chain reaction. Millonarios was Real Madrid before Real Madrid. The hierarchy told Pedernera to recruit some teammates, and his own personal recruitment drive saw 2 of River's best in Nestor Rossi and, of course, Alfredo Di Stefano defect to Colombia. Soon enough, players from all over South America and Europe, largely from Hungary and the United Kingdom, participated in El Dorado. Millonarios were the best, the most famous and the most successful, romping to the 1949 title by averaging over 4 goals a game. By 1951, 133 Argentines played in Colombia, and by that point, an agreement was reached to end El Dorado. Before the golden age of football in Colombia could be called, the most important friendly in football history had to be played. Millonarios 4, Real Madrid 2. The score, tactics and 21 of the 22 players completely meaningless, as most friendlies are. This was the day Alfredo Di Stefano and Real Madrid first met. Another great Alfred somehow sums up the situation almost perfectly. This one's surname, though, was Hitchcock. In a chat about filmmaking, the great director was describing the difference between suspense and surprise in regards to the act of revealing the presence of a bomb under a table where 2 characters are seated. The surprise option would involve an innocent conversation interrupted by an unseen bomb exploding. This allows the audience a moment of emotion. The suspense option, however, where the bomb is revealed to the audience before it is to the characters, therefore the audience is forced to sit through an otherwise mundane scene riddled with emotion before the bomb inevitably explodes. The only difference in the early 1950s was that each character in the most important transfer play in football in history was looking the bomb dead in the eye. Pacto de Lima stated that El Dorado would cease by 1954. In the interim, FIFA ruled that players had to either return to their former clubs, and failing that, Colombian clubs had to pay the players' former clubs to keep the quote-unquote illegally taken players. The deadline was October 1954. In the meantime, a transfer embargo was placed on Colombia. Many Argentines simply returned home, as was the case with Nestor Rossi, because Colombian clubs of El Dorado were either unwilling or unable to purchase the players that played for them. Alfredo di Stefano, however, was not one of the bottle. Clutching on to the advance of his Millonarios wage packet, Alfredo di Stefano travelled home for Christmas 1952. He'd never returned to Millonarios, so the Colombians denounced him, and Di Stefano fell into a dark footballing limbo. He was unable to play for River Plate, as Millonarios didn't have to agree to part with him for another 2 years. The great potential of Alfredo Di Stefano was quashed with his premature retirement. It was only Spanish whispers that coaxed him out. There was a club that could afford to remove him from his bind, and they were the so-called best team in Europe, FC Barcelona. Barcelona went through the proper FIFA-approved channels, as stated in Pacto de Lima, by approaching his legal club, River Plate. At the same time, the underbelly that was Real Madrid went what they believed to be as straight to the source. They contacted their old pals, Millonarios, and approached them for the transfer of Alfredo Di Stefano. The result was a fatal four-way of transfer mess. Millonarios couldn't sell Di Stefano to Real Madrid without River's agreement, and River couldn't sell Di Stefano to their preference of Barcelona until Millonarios agreed to give him up, and they didn't need to until 1954. But being in cahoots with Real, they weren't going to cede control of Di Stefano to River just so the Argentine could transfer straight to Barcelona. From Di Stefano's Christmas return home to Real Madrid's board meeting after Easter, the limbo continued. And that particular board meeting in the Spanish capital was pivotal in laying out Madrid's entire transfer strategy for the next 70 years. Still smarting from the rejection of Laszlo Kubala years prior, Bernabeu declared that Real Madrid must sign the best players, and being that Di Stefano fitted that, they must move heaven and earth to sign the Argentine. In expectation, Di Stefano flew from Buenos Aires to Madrid on May 22nd, 1953, a mere pit stop on the way to Barcelona, where he would room with who he deemed to be a future teammate in Laszlo Kubala. With a 4 million peseta fee agreed with River Plate, Barcelona saw that as 99% of the task completed, with just Millonarios' confirmation needed. Therefore, Di Stefano took to the training field to get acquainted with his new teammates, only to be prevented from doing so for the foreseeable future. In his memoirs, Di Stefano wrote that he didn't care if he played for Barca or Real, he just wanted to play. Yet, he had given Barcelona his word that he would join them and, for all intents and purposes, appeared as much as a Barcelona player as Laszlo Kubala. Finally, a number came from Colombia that would see the end to this bizarre episode. Millonarios wanted 1.3 million pesetas to release Di Stefano. Barcelona balked and withdrew their offer. From then on, Millonarios kept their word to Santiago Bernabeu and Real Madrid. Yet, the limbo continued, and a full summer was allowed to play out without resolution. A Francoist policy that summer banned all foreign imports, which would extend to footballers. That had Di Stefano leaning towards a swift conclusion to the saga and a return home to Buenos Aires. Until the policy was partly rowed back on and transfers that featured foreign players that were currently in negotiation could be completed, it served to pull an increasingly restless Di Stefano back in. Real had a deal with the Colombians, Barca with the Argentines, so in essence both held the rights to Di Stefano. Then things got weird. Barcelona tried to sell the transfer rights for a player who couldn't play for them to an interested Juventus. Real Madrid, meanwhile, were never going to do the same. Finally, the authorities had to get involved, and with the El Dorado deadline over a year away, it was in the interests of Di Stefano for this transfer to get over the line. And it wasn't just footballing authorities, but the Spanish government too. And in a way that only government can do, the tone-deaf suggestion of sharing Di Stefano was unfurled, like the dead body from a carpet straight into the canal that it ought to have been. And whilst the Football Federation instantly dismissed the lunacy of the entire situation, as well as the idea that Real Madrid should be allowed to sign him, the screeching tyres of a hastily arranged U-turn could be heard in the distance. Call it the influence of Real Madrid, call it highway robbery, call it whatever you want, but even more shovels of conspiracy were heaped onto an already precarious situation. The suggestion that Alfredo di Stefano be shared between Real Madrid and Barcelona was confirmed. He would play in the white of Real Madrid for the remainder of the 1953-54 season before trotting out for Barcelona the following campaign, before reverting to Madrid in time for the 1955-56 season. Of course, it wouldn't last. By October, Barcelona gave up on Di Stefano, which left Real Madrid to pay 5.75 million pesetas to each of Barcelona, River Plate and Millonarios. That's just 450,000 pesetas more than the deal Barcelona had on a silver platter months prior. It was the most expensive $27,000 that Barcelona never spent, and therefore the slowest, most bizarre Hitchcockian bomb had finally been defused. 2 days after the deal was put to bed for good, a timely Clasico, the first of a new dawn, was scheduled to be played. And predictably, Alfredo di Stefano exploded, scoring 2 of Real Madrid's 5 goals in a 5-0 humiliation. Football was never the same again. In a roundabout way, we've got the British shitrag Daily Mail to thank for the all-encompassing beast that is the UEFA Champions League. The quote-unquote newspaper worked up L'Equipe's Gabriel Hano into enough of a frenzy that he simply had to devise a tournament to prove them wrong. Upon the dramatic winning of a floodlit friendly against Hungarian outfit Honved, the Daily Mail proclaimed Wolverhampton Wanderers the best club team in the world. This, of course, neglected to mention incredible teams such as Dynamo Moscow, who had toured England in recent memory and embarrassed their teams, as well as those that hadn't touched down on British soil yet, namely Barcelona and Real Madrid. Wolves vs Honved is now seen as a test event for what would become the European Cup, a competition filled with evening kickoffs all around the continent, enabled by the new technology of floodlit fields. But the European Cup was really driven, as many great things are, by the spite of a single person. Gabriel Hano didn't believe Wolves were the best team in the world, so he sought to disprove it. The European Cup, therefore, was born in 1955. It came in a timely manner for Real Madrid and Alfredo di Stefano, who had just finished up winning their second consecutive La Liga title. This one won with a record points tally. From the off, it was clear that this Real Madrid was different. Their immensely talented front line included the homegrown winger Paco Gento, as well as Hector Real and, of course, Alfredo di Stefano. Their foreign flavour mixed with Spanish furia made them a cut above. Barcelona desperately tried to match them, adding to their own Hungarian spice Laszlo Kubala with his compatriots Zoltan Cibor and Sandor Kocsis, as well as a homegrown star of their own. The original Luis Suarez, known as the Architect. Like all good football competitions, it was inaugurated with a sprinkling of suspicion from outside forces. There was nobody better at being suspicious in football than the English, therefore the FA barred English champions Chelsea from participating. With other invitations around Europe rebuffed, Real Madrid was sure to be joined by Barcelona in the first staging of the European Cup. Until Barcelona reverted to their English roots and rejected it. To paraphrase their eventual manager, Helenio Herrera, If failing to sign Alfredo di Stefano was the lead violinist of grave mistakes, then rejecting the European Cup could well have been the entire orchestra. The Barcelona hierarchy claimed to have never even heard of the rampantly successful L'Équipe or of Gabriel Hanot, so declined to participate. They say that two wrongs don't make a right, and Barcelona's two enormous wrongs postponed their graduation as a global powerhouse by almost half a century. Seeing as Santiago Bernabéu had made such a success of building the literal foundations of Real Madrid on an enormous stadium and foreign talent, Barcelona had taken half of those schematics and now set about procuring the other half. In 1957, the Camp Nou was built, but it was too late. Real Madrid had already become the best team in world football, officially as well. Aside from the two captured La Ligas before the European Cup, Real Madrid won the first two editions of the continental competition and had just learned how to team success back home with success in Europe. As the Camp Nou's paint dried, Real Madrid won their very first European Cup and La Liga double. If that wasn't heartbreaking enough, then Alfredo di Stefano lining up in Barcelona colours just for a charity match shattered Catalan hearts into a million different pieces. In the Blaugrana of Barca, the Argentine linked up with Laszlo Kabala like an absolute dream, converging on a 6-1 win over Bologna. A meaningless scoreline, a meaningless opponent, of course, but perhaps a glimpse into an alternate universe. By this point, Real Madrid were conquering everything. They had disposed of French side Stade de Reims in the first ever European Cup final and rubbed their opponents' noses in it by taking their best player from them, Raymond Kopa. The fact that Kopa worked best as a central player and would be shunted out to the right didn't seem to bother Bernabéu whatsoever. He wanted a player, so he got the player. It also didn't stop Real Madrid or Kopa from being successful. After besting Fiorentina in the following year's final and Sevilla by 5 points in La Liga, Real Madrid almost completed football in 1958. The European Cup was won from Milan. Di Stefano scored in his third consecutive final with his 10th goal of the competition that year, and La Liga was confidently won from Atletico Madrid. Finally, Athletic Club were next in the Copa final. If any football club was to win the first ever treble in European football, then Real Madrid were quickly becoming the most ideal recipients of such a success. Until the team from Bilbao beat them comfortably 2-0. Real weren't satisfied, so they jumped through FIFA's hoops to sign Hungary's Ferenc Puskás, who was part of the banned Hungarian contingent. Whilst they finally gave up their Spanish crown to Barcelona in successive seasons and in the process relinquishing their newfound place as La Liga's most successful team, Real continued to purr in Europe. The commercialist aspect of lucrative foreign tours and retaining their grip on the European Cup was more bountiful than the mere procession of La Liga for a third and fourth straight year. Yes, Barcelona beat them in the final furlong as part of a goal difference triumph in the 1959-60 La Liga season, and Atletico Madrid pipped them in the 1960 Copa final. But they were both eviscerated when it mattered, in European Cup semi-finals. After a three-legged triumph over Atletico, Stade de Reims were no match again for Real Madrid in a European Cup final in 1959, as Real led from the very first minute, and of course, Alfredo di Stefano scored in his fourth consecutive European Cup final. After routing Barcelona home and away the following year at the same stage, came the magnum opus of not just Real Madrid, but of any other football team. For the closest possible equivalent in the modern day, see Barcelona in the 2011 Champions League final. Real Madrid certainly weren't at their peak, but for one night only they reminded everybody of their powers with possibly the greatest exhibition of top-level football in the sport's history. Alfredo di Stefano, as always, scored in a European Cup final, his fifth in succession, and quickly added goals 2 and 3. It would have been the first hat-trick in a European Cup final too, had teammate Ferenc Puskás not confirmed a hat-trick of his own, with 2 goals in 4 second-half minutes, a full quarter of an hour before Di Stefano netted his third. 7-3 was the score. Eintracht Frankfurt were demolished. Real Madrid were undisputedly the kings of Europe and will be forevermore. Currently, only 4 other clubs have won the European Cup or Champions League 5 times. It took Milan until 1994 to do so, Liverpool until 2005, Bayern Munich until 2013, and finally, Barcelona until 2015. Between Di Stefano's arrival and the 5th European Cup in 1960, Real had 5 coaches in 7 years, but it didn't seem to matter. The constant wasn't the manager, as it is with some footballing empires, it was the president. Santiago Bernabeu built the first collection of Galacticos, and they had broken football. Within those Galacticos, Alfredo di Stefano was the centrepiece. He had played 171 consecutive La Liga appearances from his debut up until February 1959. Of course, all good records must be shattered. Just as Di Stefano's appearance record was, so was Real Madrid's pristine European Cup record. Whilst Los Blancos were running amok in the Premier competition, Barcelona arguably had the harder task of winning the Intercities Fairs Cup that shares its lineage with the UEFA Cup and Europa League. Whilst Real Madrid had the challenge of facing just one opponent per country, Barcelona could feasibly find themselves against multiple teams from the prevailing forces of the time in England, France and Italy. Domestically, very little could split the teams in the first 5 years of the European age. Both won 2 titles back home, yet it could be argued that the 3 seasons in which Real didn't claim Spanish League gold was in campaigns centred around the European Cup. Their first continental triumph wasn't paired with a La Liga, and as Europe took precedent and players got older, their 4th and 5th European Cups weren't complemented with any domestic success. Meanwhile, Barcelona participated in the Fairs Cups that could stretch to 2 and even 3 years at any one time. They won the competition 3 times, but in every single one of those triumphs, it was under the heavy shadow of Real Madrid. Barcelona won the Fairs Cup in 1958, Real defeated Milan to become European champions. Barcelona won the Fairs Cup in 1960, Real defeated Frankfurt to become European champions. Barcelona won the Fairs Cup in 1966, Real defeated Partizan Belgrade to become European champions. It was never teams like Frankfurt, Partizan, Reims or even Milan that were Real's equal around this time, it was Barcelona. So it would make sense that the first team to eliminate Real Madrid from the European Cup was Barcelona. A 2-2 draw in Madrid in the first round of the European Cup gave Barcelona the belief. The 2-1 second leg triumph at the Camp Nou confirmed it. And via Czechoslovakia and West Germany, Barcelona continued the Spanish lineage in the European Cup final, only this time Real weren't the ones in the limelight. Yet it was just so typical of Barcelona's losing battle with fate that they would have finally entered a European Cup final and come up against a generational team that simply wasn't there to defeat Real Madrid in the first 5 years of the competition. Bela Gutmann and his Benfica team turned up in Bern and edged an entertaining 3-2 final before enlightening everybody that it wasn't a fluke by defeating the other mammoth Spanish team the following year. Real Madrid felt the full force of Eusebio, who hadn't been present in the prior year's final but scored twice to nullify Ferenc Puskás' second European Cup final hat-trick. In Real's first European Cup final defeat, it was the first European Cup final in which the great Di Stefano wouldn't score. The same was true of his last meaningful match in a Los Blancos shirt 2 years later, in defeat at the same stage to Inter. Just as the dynasty of Real Madrid had come and gone, so too it had for Barcelona, as the new forces led by Eusebio in Lisbon and the Catenaccio in Milan would also do. Helenio Herrera had left Barcelona and made sure to take his prized possession Luis Suarez with him, and making sure that Barcelona wouldn't compete at the same level for a generation. European football was gripped by defensive stoicism, and whilst it would sometimes open up a window for Real Madrid to win a European Cup, as in 1966, that particular avenue slammed shut with a new kind of football from the north. It would change not just the Clasico but the world, and Real Madrid felt the full force of it in 1973 as Ajax beat them home and away in the European Cup semi-final on the way to a third title in succession. And nobody had done that since Real Madrid in the 1950s, and nobody has bettered it since. In all, the total footballing regimes of Ajax and Bayern Munich would retain control of the European Cup for 6 years. It would be a while before both Real Madrid and Barcelona would run in similar circles. Alfredo di Stefano's legacy is great, and in Spain nobody could hold a candle to him. Before the modern era of Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi, the two footballing figures deified throughout the world were Pelé and Maradona. Every country had its pretender who could claim to be stood on the podium of football greats. From Johan Cruyff and Franz Beckenbauer to Zinedine Zidane and George Best, each country was sensible enough to realise that theirs was a distant third. But in Spain, their adopted son of Alfredo di Stefano was on a pedestal high enough to meet both Pelé and Maradona eye to eye. He scored 308 goals in 396 games for Real Madrid. Only Karim Benzema, Raul and Cristiano Ronaldo have surpassed that, and only the latter has a better goal ratio. He won 5 European Cups, playing in each final. The only players since that great Real team that can match that are Paolo Maldini and Cristiano Ronaldo, as well as the trio of Karim Benzema, Dani Carvajal and Luka Modric from the most recent Real domination. Di Stefano's 8 La Liga titles are only bettered outside of Madrid by the quartet of Lionel Messi, Gerard Piqué, Sergio Busquets and Andres Iniesta, all members of the greatest Barcelona team ever assembled. He was the first player to win multiple Ballon d'Or crowns and the third most Pichichi trophies in history. Yet there is a great tragedy to his career, a missing piece of the jigsaw from his time in football, the FIFA World Cup. That a player of Di Stefano's calibre failed to appear at a World Cup isn't too uncommon. Plenty of great names did before him, and even more have failed to do so after his time. Unlike players like George Best or George Weah, he wasn't burdened by the misfortune of geography. Unlike Abidi Pelé and Duncan Edwards, he wasn't burdened by mistiming or tragedy. The fact that he was born into a football-mad country that has only been absent for 4 World Cups and was adopted by one that has missed just 6 and still didn't play in the competition is a travesty. Argentina withdrew from the 1950 competition as Alfredo di Stefano played in El Dorado, so even an unlikely workaround wouldn't have resulted in his presence in Brazil. In 1954, neither Argentina nor Spain appeared in the World Cup. The former withdrew yet again, and his new homeland failed to qualify. He finally appeared for Spain in 1957, averaging a goal a game, but it wasn't enough as neither he nor fellow adoptive Spaniard and Barcelona player Laszlo Kubala couldn't steer Spain to the World Cup. And when Spain did qualify 4 years later, Di Stefano was cruelly ruled out as La Roja crashed out at the group phase. Real Madrid's legacy is even greater, and it all stems back from the Bernabeu chaired board meeting in April 1953. Ever since, all of their star-studded and successful lineups, their philosophy has been about the Galactico. In the 1950s, Puskás, Di Stefano, Real and Copa ruled the roost. Even the Vulture squad of the 1980s, renowned for its homegrown talent in Emilio Butragueño, was underpinned by the stars of Jorge Valdano and Hugo Sanchez. The Galacticos of Figo, Zidane, Ronaldo, Carlos and Beckham speak for themselves, whilst world record bids for the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo and Gareth Bale in Florentino Perez's second stint at presidency formed the bedrock of the first team to ever retain the Champions League. Should they be successful again, the third inauguration of a Perez Galactico team has seen a more youthful tint of Tchouaméni, Camavinga, Bellingham, Vinicius Jr. and in the future, certainly Endrick and even possibly Kylian Mbappe. Yet Barcelona had toyed with the idea of aping their more successful rivals. It has never really truly worked for the long term. The club has broken the world record transfer fee 3 times in each of the last 3 decades of the 20th century, and it never worked out in the long term. Johan Cruyff arrived in 1973 from Ajax, and he brought expectations which initially did deliver, as they leapt from the bottom of La Liga to the top to win the club's first title in 14 years. Cruyff's first season would prove a peak, and he would leave 5 years later, only adding a further Copa del Rey. His impact wouldn't be felt at the club for a while. After the 1982 World Cup in Spain, Diego Maradona decided to remain in the country and Barcelona broke the transfer record to help him do so. A couple of cup triumphs was all Barcelona got out of him in his 2 years. From a positive note, the final act of his time at the Camp Nou was to spark a mass brawl with Athletic Club players in the '84 Copa del Rey final. In the 90s, Ronaldo broke the transfer record twice. The first occasion was to turn up at the Camp Nou and win a cup double. The second was to leave the Camp Nou a year later. A brief success like Maradona, but the teams that they left behind didn't perform to standards in the long term. Before finally in the late 2010s, Barcelona moved wildly from depending on La Masia to wildly spending cash they didn't have. Neymar's sale from Barcelona sparked a chain reaction and 3 transfers in 3 consecutive years above €100 million. Ousmane Dembele, Philippe Coutinho and Antoine Griezmann all flopped and were moved on rather quickly. Di Stefano turned Real into record Spanish champions, leaving the club with 10 titles in 1964, which has since evolved to 35 at the time of writing. Since Di Stefano's departure, Barcelona have added 19 titles, and outside of Atletico's additional 7 since 1964, Spanish football has become a closed book. Outside of what is now known as the Big Three, Valencia's doubling of La Liga titles to 6 is the most successful. The city of Seville hasn't seen a league title since Di Stefano turned up in Spain, and the only new winners of La Liga have been Real Sociedad's double in the 80s and Deportivo's sole win at the turn of the millennium. Meanwhile, Athletic Club's own successes in the 80s are the only other La Liga triumphs outside the Big Three. 14 La Liga titles were won by clubs outside of the Clasico in the 22 seasons of La Liga before Alfredo di Stefano. Only 16 La Ligas from the 71 seasons since have been won by clubs outside of the Clasico. In the decade after General Franco's 1975 death, La Liga titles were split evenly between the Clasico and not. As the Basque Country threatened the fabric of both Spanish football and Spanish life, Real were midway through a European drought. Barcelona was still yet to win a European Cup and made do with the very rare sight of a league win. The European Cup final was no longer the preserve of the Clasico teams. Real Madrid were undone in a final of fear with new dominant force Liverpool in 1981, whilst Barcelona were similarly frozen in 1986 debacle against Steaua. Total football had been brought to Barcelona long before Johan Cruyff rocked up in '73 via Vic Buckingham and Rinus Michels, but it was only until the second coming of Cruyff as manager in 1988 that success and total football were teamed together at the Camp Nou. Even Real Madrid were being successful and building a squad around academy players, which acted as a vehicle for Johan Cruyff to turbocharge La Masia and have full autonomy over how he felt Barcelona should act. The Vulture squad's 5-year dominance over La Liga, without any luck in the European Cup, became the Dream Team's 4-year residency in the same competition, courtesy of winning the league. And at the first time of asking, Cruyff finally delivered Barcelona's holy grail. He had transferred the power back to Catalonia, they had defeated Sampdoria, they dominated the league, they were Spain's footballing force as modern-day football was birthed in 1992. And with the concentration of power to an increasingly smaller collection of Western European clubs after the mid-90s Bosman ruling, it was only a matter of time before Real Madrid got their act together as well. Real straddled the millennium, winning 3 of 5 Champions Leagues before another Dutchman claimed Barca's second continental crown in 2006, before the centrepiece of the Clasico's dominance. Between 2009 and 2010, Real Madrid and Barcelona accounted for 7 of the 10 Champions League winners. Real Madrid perpetuated from their 1953 foundations of the Galactico, Barcelona entrenched in the newer ideologies of La Masia, accelerated from 1988. There are many who try and fail to be a pound shop Real Madrid, splurging cash left, right and centre, but it never forms a solid enough foundation for prosperity. We've been subjected to far too many clubs with cash bursting out of their briefcases on the mad trolley dash of the Premier League before being crushed under the payday loan-like structure of the EFL. They usually live in less renowned environments than the hallowed turf at the Bernabeu. Of course, there are some who take leaves from the books of Johan Cruyff and those whom he inspired and fail, yet the repercussions are less catastrophic, the gamble less pronounced, and any glory gleaned from such an approach is laced with a sweeter taste. But even those who are reckless with money off the pitch in a vague, excitable replication of a Galactico in waiting usually play, or at least attempt to, in a manner taught by Johan Cruyff and his disciples. The top 5 leagues in Europe are flush with football influenced by Barcelona. That is to be expected, with more eyeballs, more opportunities and more money, as the powers that be can readily access trends continent-wide at will. Those who don't play to the ideals of the press, of fluidity, of interchangeability, of free-flowing football now are the ones that stick out. Some trends might creep on out of the swamp, like the re-inverting of the pyramid or of long ball football, but football as it was meant to be played, according to Johan Cruyff, lives on through almost everybody in football, even after his 2016 death. He most famously and most directly influenced Pep Guardiola, his former player at Barcelona. Guardiola then passes his ideas on to coaches like Mikel Arteta and Xavi, which means 3 Champions League clubs in Manchester City, Arsenal and perpetually, of course, Barcelona play the Cruyff way. Guardiola's partner in the Barcelona midfield, none other than Luis Enrique, so that ticks off Paris Saint-Germain. Also, every Dutch coach has the idealistic Cruyffian value, so in comes Erik ten Hag's Manchester United at least attempting to play like Johan Cruyff's Barcelona. Then there's the offshoots. Jurgen Klopp, as well as everyone affected by the Stuttgart School of Footballing Coaching, that is Tuchel, Nagelsmann and many more, share a lineage from an influence standpoint thanks to Arrigo Sacchi and Valery Lobanovsky, who all feasted on total football. So what are we left with? Real Madrid had the riches of gold formed off the back of Alfredo di Stefano. Meanwhile, to quote the blonde arrow himself, in the midst of the Clasico's most heated periods between Guardiola and Mourinho in the 2010s, Barcelona football was simply brilliant. Their superiority was there for the whole planet to see. To see this team in action is a delight. Madrid are a side with no personality. They just run back and forth constantly, tiring themselves out. Barcelona were a lion, Madrid a mouse. And whilst you can buy a kind of philosophy and accompany it with silverware, as Real Madrid have done, perhaps the beauty represented by Barcelona's organic self-sustainability was the richest virtue.